Let me ask the audience to start with, how many people here still think China is communist? Put up your hands. So that's a distinct minority. Now, when I was in China, I was there in the 90s, then I was there for most of the last decade, I was constantly struck by how many business people would come to China and declare that they'd never met a communist in China. And towards the start of my book, I use one particular example, which always gets attention, about how Rupert Murdoch over dinner, in fact, just after I would set up the office for the Australian there, declared that he'd never met a communist in China. And this statement really struck me. Now, Mr. Murdoch is no fool. He could hardly be blamed for making this statement. China doesn't look communist anymore. There's none of the, even back in the 90s, no food queues, not much of the sort of public drabness that we associate with the old Soviet Union and the like. All the images that we associate with communism and the Cold War are gone. You don't see anything like the Shanghai, or you never saw anything like the Shanghai skyline nestling next to Red Square, for example. And the only time that Mr. Murdoch might have thought he was in a country which had been communist is basically in the flea market on the way home, where he could have picked up a copy of the Little Red Book. Now, he said that for good reason. I mean, the only communists that many business people meet in China are ones who want to do business with them. Of course, in Mr. Murdoch's case, it turned out the only communists he met in China eventually are the ones who wanted to thwart him doing business in China, but that was because he was in the media. But he's right in one sense. It's not like the Soviet Union. You can't see the party very easily. There's no surprise that he would miss seeing the Communist Party, because at least it exists largely underground, and I'll try and illustrate that for you during this speech. So it's not surprising that people are confused about the Communist Party, which is why there's lots of jokes in how you describe it. Some people describe it as the world's largest chamber of commerce, or the world's largest mixed business. The head of the private equity group Blackstone was in London recently giving a speech, and he said he finally understood how China worked and the Politburo worked. He said it was just like Goldman Sachs. You had 30 partners who were who had access to all the information, knew everything, and of course were on every side of every deal. China also, funnily enough, fits the old Soviet joke about communism. I don't know whether any of you remember this, but what is the definition of communism? And the definition of communism is it's the longest route from capitalism to capitalism. The Chinese ambassador in London also actually had quite a good angle on this recently as well, whereas he described China, and I think this was quite astute, as China is run has a communist government, but it is not a communist country. So, there are lots of governing traditions in China. There's obviously a bureaucratic tradition which goes back hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years or so, of having a strong central government, the old imperial model, in which the emperor, much like the party now, uses various different tricks or ruses, if you like, to keep control on the far-flung, if you like, and wayward provinces. Just like the emperor used to send spies out into the military camps in the provinces so he could have an independent source of information back and the like, to keep his rule at the centre intact. So you've got the old imperial tradition. You've got lots of modern kind of add-ons in China, which McKinsey would be proud of. All officials in China of a certain rank have what management consultants call the 360-degree review. They have these KPIs, key performance indicators, which are, pages and pages long, which I think, in fact, usually comes back to the economy. But they're there. So you've got the old tradition, you've got the new tradition, but what struck me once I started to look at this in China is just how traditionally communist the governing hardware is. In fact, the governing hardware in China, the core of it, is basically all still Soviet, which is remarkable. Or instead of Soviet, you might say Leninist. which is if you use that word, it usually puts people off. But what is a Leninist? What is a Leninist system? Basically, a Leninist system is when you have a political party which controls the government, which sits atop the government, which, as in the Soviet Union, certainly in China now, which sits above the law, and that is a Leninist system. Which is why, if you go to functions in China, they will always, the introductions will always talk about first the party and state leaders. The party always comes before the state. And when I lived in Shanghai and I would try to explain this system to people, I'd tell them to go to the Shanghai party headquarters, which is in Kamping Road in the old French concession, and to watch the cars coming out of the compound, because the number plates would tell you. The party secretary of Shanghai's number plate was 0001. The mayor, the top government post, is 0002. And then the executive vice mayor and probably the deputy party secretary, 0003. It's all, set out on the number plates as well. But what precisely does the Communist Party control in China these days? Now, the first answer to that is much, much less than it used to. Any of us who've gone to China in the last 30, 20, 10, 5 years would see that the individual space for Chinese, or the space for individual Chinese to live in, has expanded dramatically. You can, own your own home, buy a car, travel overseas, accumulate wealth, often with care, of course. The more you accumulate, you obviously can't have as many children as you want, but even the one-child policy is administered flexibly in many areas, inflexibly in others. But if the party, for most people going about their daily business in China, is largely like a kind of radio that's left on in the background, kind of low, and if they need to turn it up and get your attention, they can do so. But the strength of the Communist Party these days is it by and large does not interfere directly in people's personal lives. The old neighbourhood committees in the old days in China, which the granny would sit at the entrance to the sort of the work unit in the flat, that's largely been busted up because of the privatisation of the housing market and the demolition of the old housing compounds and the like. So if the party has removed itself largely from people's private lives, it's been very careful to keep hold of three things, which is the core of its power. There's the military. Many people forget that this is not the state's military, it's not the government's military. The People's Liberation Army is the party's military. It's under direct control of the party secretary. The second pillar of power is propaganda, which basically propaganda in China is media. Many of you will know that the Chinese are not silly. They know a department called the propaganda department has a terrible Goebbels-like ring in English. So in English it's called the publicity department, but in Chinese it's still called the propaganda department. And that controls all media. It controls how history is taught and the content of history. Now obviously it's very difficult to, in the era of the internet, to control the media as it used to. And I think rather than control, we should say it channels the media. But in any case, the propaganda department sits above the media. And the third pillar of party power in China is personnel, which is run out of a body called the Central Organisation Department. Now, I don't want to turn a lunchtime lecture on a Monday in Sydney into a sort of pol sci seminar, but I've got a diagram here which may help us a little. Right. So the General Secretary or Party Secretary Hu Jintao sits at the top. The Central Committee under that is kind of like a enlarged board of directors for the Communist Party. That has all sorts of people. It has people from state companies, from the military, from the provinces and the like. The Central Military Commission, as you can see, is directly under the Party Secretary. The Central Military Commission is the body that sits atop the military. If you go to the Defence Ministry in Beijing, that's kind of like a shell. That's not important. It's the Central Military Commission that's important. The central, wonderfully named Central Discipline Inspection Commission if they ever legalised S&M parlours in Sydney, that might be the body that regulated them. But that is in fact the party's internal anti-corruption unit. If you're a senior party official in China, you're not arrested or investigated by the police. You are investigated for your sins by the party itself, so that you always know when an investigation is finished, because somebody's expelled from the party. The courts are not an afterthought, but they're process following that, where somebody is sentenced. The trial is really over by then. Now, the important departments, as we mentioned, are the organisation department and the propaganda department, and going down below, the Central Politics and Law Committee. That's very important. Politics comes before the law. It's a very tellingly named department. I always like to remind people that the Chief Justice in China does not have a law degree. He comes up through the political side of the party system, which is not to say the law doesn't play a much greater role in China these days, but ultimately the law is subordinate to the party. So let me try and give you an example, and I've used this in my book, but I've Australianised it for this lecture. So let's try and imagine we had a body in Australia like the Central Organisation Department, which handles, it's the HR department. So imagine if you had a single body in Australia which oversaw the appointment, I'm not saying they choose everybody, because the Politburo obviously chooses who goes where, particularly for senior appointments, but they have to go through a party process before they're formally appointed. So just imagine if we had an organisation department in Australia which oversaw the appointment of the entire cabinet, every premier, the mayors of every large city, the heads of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander bodies, something that in China, without being offensive about it, would be done through the Minorities Bureau, because they're subordinate to the majority Han Chinese. The heads of every regulatory agency, the chief executives of big companies like BHP and Rio. You can see why in the current Chinese context that's a very attractive power to have. But all the big banks, basically all the 50 biggest companies in the country are all appointed, the tops, directly by the party, and in fact about 3 or 4 levels down. The justices on the High Court in Australia, the editors of every major paper. When I was writing this down for an Australian context, I'd written down the heads of every major paper from the Daily Telegraph to the Australian, but I realised I had to broaden that out, because that's all under one news limited organisation department, if you like. But the heads of every major paper, Fairfax, the ABC, Sky News, they are all party appointments. The universities, the big universities, the top person at large universities are Communist Party appointments, and that's very particularly became tighter and is particularly important after 1989, where the universities were seen to have been incubators for the anti-government demonstrations of that year. And of course also the big think tanks. So somebody like Dr. Wesley here would also be a party appointment. That's why you have the largest Chinese think tank, which is the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which does lots of fantastic work, has lots of great scholars, but the person at the top of that department has the status of a vice minister and is also a party appointment, which is why a lot of the old-timers at CAS still refer to CAS as a department. Now, not only that, an extraordinary job to do, but if you go to the organisation department building in Beijing, which is west of Tiananmen Square, it's got a shiny new office tower. There is no sign outside the building saying what the business of the people who work in there is inside. The organisation department still does not have a listed phone number. And of course, it goes without saying that the debate over appointments happens, and I'm sure there's great debate internally, happens basically in secret. It's not sort of canvassed in the papers in a sort of knock-down, drag-out way that it is in a country like Australia, the UK, or in particular the US. So that's a little thing. It sounds like a little thing, but for me, when I thought about that, that's just extraordinary. Why don't they have a sign outside the building? The same goes for the propaganda department. There's no listed phone number. There's no sign outside the building. It's a level of secrecy which is absurd because everybody knows what the building is for, but also kind of pre-modern. It was very difficult for me when I was researching this book to find people in the organisation department to talk to. That's even though in about the last year or so they have appointed a spokesperson. You just can't get his number. It was very difficult for me to find people to talk to at the organisation department, and it's usually the case in China. If you go out into the provinces, things are a little bit more relaxed out there than they are right in the centre of Beijing. And I spoke to somebody at the Hunan organisation department. You must remember, and I should have mentioned this, that this structure is replicated at the provincial level, the city level, and the township level, every level of government. In other words, has a propaganda department and an organisation department and the like. But in any case, I met this bloke from the Hunan organisation department, and I said to him, why are you so secretive? And he was kind of nonplussed by this question. He said, well, we don't face the people, we face the government. All the cadres know where we live. It's like knowing where your parents are. Certainly he felt no compunction at all for them to be public about what they're doing. Now, like everything in China, the sheer size is remarkable. Actually, the latest membership list, I think, has 78 million members. It's gone up from the 73 that Michael mentioned before. That's about 1 in 12 adult Chinese. That is not exceptional in communist parties in the old former Soviet Union and the satellite states. I think it used to be about 1 in 10 adult Chinese, adults who were members of the party. Not only that, but in China, of course, in recent years, the membership base has been broadened. It's not a farmers and workers party, if you like, or a peasant and workers party. You now can be officially a member of the party if you're an entrepreneur. And if you look at the rich lists in China, I think about, something about a quarter to a third of the richest 100 people in China are party members. And if you go to the top universities, and I interviewed students at top universities at Tsinghua and Peking University and the like, the best people in all the classes, and these are the elite universities, which are very, very hard to get into, are invited to join the party. So it's not only a broad-based party, if you like, but it's also increasingly attracting the elite as well, and not just the elite in government, but the wealthy elite. And why wouldn't you join? Because there's no better networking opportunity in the country. Now, that's the control side of the party, but if the party was just obsessed with control, it would have collapsed like just about every other communist party in the world. But the reason it hasn't is because the obsessions that you see illustrated here also run in another direction, in particularly with the economy. So the party, since 1979, since Deng Xiaoping took over, the big market-based reforms then have been equally obsessed about creating a strong economy and also, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, adapting mechanisms of governance to, control what is an increasingly more complex task of running China in a globalized world. So it's kind of used to be bewildering sitting in Beijing to keep track of every day the orders that would go out to binding officials to, in theory, improve their jobs. They had to declare their private income, declare their relatives' private income, cut pollution in their areas, improve energy efficiency, pay attention to the complaints of residents and petitioners in their area, and so on. Now, obviously, a lot of these rules are observed in the breach, but the very fact that they exist and the party is thinking about them, and the fact they can be enforced if the centre gets really serious, is significant, I think, in itself. Now, the enforcement often depends on what the rules and targets are. As many people would know, if you're involved in the resources sector, China has, for the last 10, 15 years, has had great plans to rationalise the steel industry. It's had great plans to rationalise the automaking industry. But while the country's been booming and these parts of the economy have been growing so quickly, little of that has happened. It might still in the future, and certainly they've laid the groundwork for it. But these sorts of rules often used to remind me about, if you've seen Pirates of the Caribbean with the Geoffrey Rush character, I think his name's Hector Barbarossa, when he's always breaching the pirates' code, and this is raised with him, he said, oh, the code, it's just guidelines. And I think that's the case often with these multiple rules you see coming out in China every day. But in short, the party's genius, I think, is basically being able to maintain the core authoritarian powers of an old-style communist state while dumping the ideological straitjacket that originally inspired them. So you get to a situation where a genuine communist party has hitched its legitimacy very successfully to a highly entrepreneurial market economy. How long shall I speak for? Yeah. Just in short, what does the party do well? What does the party do badly? I might go a little bit over time here. You can see one thing, that the unparalleled powers of the party and something they can do well. Look at the financial crisis. Many of you in this room will probably be familiar with this. China is doing terrifically now, if you look at headline GDP growth and output generally. But we often forget at the end of 2008, the Chinese economy basically fell in a hole just like the rest of the world. We had figures of 22 million people suddenly unemployed and the like. Now, I live in the UK now. If you watch the banking system there, large numbers of the banks are state-owned, like RBS and Lloyds and the like. You look in the US, Citibank in theory is state-owned. Both the UK and the US governments have been trying to get these banks to lend, but they really can't get past the sort of the board of, the responsibilities that the executives and boards there think they have to their shareholders, or not their shareholders, I guess, to the way their business is run. But in China, it's different. If you go to the tops of the Chinese banks, they are, in many cases, they're all party members. They're all appointed by the party. The CEO of a Chinese bank, or the chairman, has the level of a vice minister in the government. Many of them, China Construction Bank, ICBC, they also sit on the central committee. Now, China had an astoundingly, I think, successful and very gutsy banking reform from about the late 90s onwards, which was to put the banks on a commercial footing and no longer having them do simply policy lending. But at a time of an emergency at the end of 2008, when the government urgently needed the economy to be reflated, then the banks were told to lend, and they did lend. And not only did they lend, and this is another strength of the Chinese state, is that they competed with each other to lend. And so I think in the first quarter of 2009, you had as much lending as for the entire year of 2008. And as far as a fiscal stimulus goes, then I think there was no more successful one in the world than there was in China. I had a long section on what the party does badly to do with one particular incident, but you can ask me about that afterwards, and you can read chapter 5 or 6 of the book. But let me just come back to try and sort of finish off, if you like. Now, at the end of the day, the party runs China, so what? We're not in the Cold War anymore. We don't so care about Reds under the beds and the like. Does it really matter? Australia is doing fantastically out of China under Communist Party rule. Why should we care? And then there's the realpolitik argument, of course, is that you can argue, and it's in the global interest to have strong rule in China, because stability in China certainly helps the whole world. Now, I think that China is going to destabilize the world whether it succeeds or fails. In theory, you can argue it will be even more destabilizing if it succeeds, because if a country the size of China's dimension grows, then everybody has to adjust. but that's simply a fact of life. And if you have a strong central rule in China, then that adjustment process might be much better handled. That's the positive argument for the party in China. You hear a lot, for example, also about the so-called Beijing Consensus. In other words, other countries copying China. I don't much believe this, unless you think of the Beijing Consensus as simply a country with an authoritarian government and a successful economy. We talk about Africa being enthralled to the Beijing Consensus, for example, but if African countries governed like China did, then certainly China would not be allowed to go into the African countries and buy freehold, if you like, their resources. About the only country in the world which remotely it resembles China, I think, is Vietnam, which also has a communist party and a market economy. So whatever people say about the Beijing Consensus, it is not easy to replicate what China has done with the bureaucratic tradition, a sort of Leninist superstructure, and obviously a highly capable bureaucracy. But it is certainly true, Beijing Consensus or not, that China now represents an alternative, if you like, governmental universe in the world which can compete with the US. And it's a real alternative these days. Does that matter? I think it matters a lot, actually, for a country like Australia, for which China is so important. China is opaque, and I think my book goes into this in great details in ways that affect us very directly. I think the Rio Tinto case is a very good example of this. There seems to be little doubt from the evidence adduced in the courts in Singapore that the Rio executives were on the take. But having said that, if the Rio deal had gone ahead with Chinalco, would this case have gone ahead? Would people have been arrested? I think not, but it's very hard to tell because the whole process of instigating a case like that is so opaque. In China, it is very difficult to disentangle the interests of the state or state entities, which are multifarious and competitive, from the government and the party, particularly since the party controls appointments so closely. And I think also, in many respects in China, the system is hostile to Western democracy and Western forms of government. Now, I think this is partly because in the Chinese media, the propaganda department bolsters belief in the system in China itself. It needs to denigrate rival systems, and I think from a Western perspective, that is what's the word? That is going to affect us greatly in the years to come. And I think we'll be dealing with this for as long as I'm alive. Finally, will the party last? I'm of the resilient authoritarianism school. I don't quite see where the party has got all the bases covered. I don't quite see if there's any alternative to the Communist Party in China. All the top officials, all the people with the knowledge of how to run China, all the networks are basically contained inside the party, and it's much like, as I say in my book, it's much like the Iraqi army after the Second Iraq War. You can disband the Iraqi army. Eventually, you had to put them back together again because nobody else could do the job. And on that note, I'll finish. Thank you.